Hi, everyone. Good afternoon, and thank you so much for joining us for a Conservatism of Creation, Building New Education Institutions. My name is Andy Smerick. I'm a senior fellow here at the Manhattan Institute, and we're here to talk about the how and the why of starting new schools, whether we're talking about colleges and universities, or high schools, or middle schools, or elementary schools, maybe preschool programs, maybe post-secondary career-focused institutions, whatever it might be. And I'm going to introduce in just a couple moments the three outstanding panelists who are going to walk us through all of this stuff. But I just wanted to take a couple moments here at the beginning to lay out why this is such an important issue right now. As probably many or all of you know, lots of parents and lots of students and lots of educators are frustrated with American education at the moment. And their frustrations can stem from many different things. Some people are just upset about the way schools have handled the pandemic. Others are starting to wonder whether higher education is worth the price, especially at private institutions. Some are worried about the loss of free speech or free inquiry on many campuses, whether K-12 or higher education. Some don't like what they're seeing taught in classrooms. Now, there are other issues, like some people just might want to have a particular school that or program that serves certain types of students who are in need, whether they're gifted or have special needs, or from rural communities or from a low-income community. And then there are some people who just want their school to have a particular kind of educational focus, whether that is using a vision of justice, or integrating faith communities or faith traditions, or maybe using a Montessori model, or focusing at the high school level on a particular occupation. Now, America's big and we're diverse and we believe in liberty and we believe in pluralism. So these kinds of differences are natural and they're good and we shouldn't shy away from them at all. The problem arises when people feel like they can't do anything to change the schools that they have, that they end up in this position of frustration because the schools that they have been given to them and there's nothing that they can do to alter them to make sure the schools fit the needs of the family or the community that they're in. And we have to remember there are lots of different reasons why schools can become sclerotic. It could be the case that the administrators have a certain way of looking at the world, or the board got stubborn, or maybe just a majority of the school's community like things exactly as they are, and it's only just 10, 15, 20% of the families that are dissatisfied. Maybe there are operational reasons that make change hard in a longstanding institution as well. So we're left with this question: what in the world do we do in these instances? Well, one option that we need to explore much more is creating new schools. And I know this can sound daunting, but we have to remember that America has gone through waves, eras of new school creation time and time again across our history. So just by way of background, there was the common schools movement in the middle of the 19th century that created literally thousands and then tens of thousands of new public schools over the decades. Later on, state governments started creating a wave of public universities. Not long after that, we had an increase in the number of high schools. Then we saw in the first half of the 20th century, K-8 Catholic schools take off, again, thousands and thousands of them. Right around the turn of that century, philanthropists got in the business of helping produce private universities, many of which are some of the most famous today. And then the charter movement beginning in the 1990s created thousands and thousands of autonomous public schools. So we've done this before. And even more importantly, this is part of an American tradition of social entrepreneurialism. Tocqueville pointed this out 200 years ago, that Americans just have this remarkable ability to identify a problem, come together with friends and neighbors, like-minded people, and create a new institution to solve a problem. We saw a lot of this during the Progressive era, certainly during the Founding era, in the middle of the 20th century. Even in the 1960s and 70s, conservatives ended up founding what became some of the most important political advocacy, cultural institutions that are affecting politics, culture in the 80s, 90s, and even up to today. So there's a history of all this. So maybe right now is the time that we take seriously the idea of the next generation, the next era of new school creation. And so our fantastic panelists are here to help us make sense of all of this. What kind of schools are needed? What do founders need to think about? What kind of policies or what kind of philanthropic efforts are needed? What are the landmines or roadblocks that people ought to be aware of? And much more. So let me introduce these great panelists of ours. First is going to be Dr. Mike McShane. He's the director of national research at EdChoice. His outstanding new book, Hybrid Homeschooling, A Guide to the Future of Education, was just released by Rowman and Littlefield. Next up is going to be Stephanie Soroki de Garcia. She is co-founder and managing director of Seton Education Partners. She helped launch this back in 2009 with the idea of giving every single child, regardless of background, access to a great Catholic education. And they now serve around 5,000 students in both Catholic and charter schools. And last but certainly not least is Dr. Samuel Goldman. He's an associate professor of political science and executive director of the Loeb Institute for Religious Freedom at George Washington University. He also has a brand new outstanding book, After Nationalism, that is out, and it was published by University of Pennsylvania Press. So just one last logistical note here. Each panelist gets 5 minutes or so to say their opening bit to get us started, and then I'm going to pepper them with questions to try to get the discourse going. Now, anyone watching this, if you have questions, comments, thoughts, don't wait till the end. Just use that chat function that should be at the bottom right of your screen. Send me questions, and I will try to integrate those as quickly as possible to make sure that this is meeting all of your interests and needs. And then we will close up shop in about an hour. So with no further ado, Mike, thanks for being with us. Do you want to get us started?
Sure. Thanks so much, Andy. And I'm super excited to talk about this topic, and not just because I'm trying to flog a book, though I should be clear, I am trying to flog a book. No, it's actually kind of wild because I looked up almost 3 years ago to the date today, on May 21st, 2018, I wrote a Forbes column entitled, "Is Hybrid Homeschooling the Wave of the Future?" Now, it was based on a conversation that I had with a hybrid homeschooler from Atlanta, Georgia. And I thought it was kind of interesting, right? This woman and I had chatted. She operated these schools that operated part-time, where students went to traditional schools for 2 or 3 days a week in many of the things that we would imagine a school looks like. They wore uniforms, they went from class to class, et cetera. And then they worked from home the other 2 or 3 days a week. And I thought, well, that's kind of interesting. Maybe some folks would be interested in that. I'm a policy guy, so it kind of makes us think about how policy might work, how might funding work, how might regulation work, how might the teacher labor market work, all those things. So I jotted down some words, posted it as a Forbes column, and kind of went on living my life. And I don't know if I've ever written any one thing that had as large of a reaction as that piece did. Not only was it viewed, I don't even know, north of 100,000 times in short order, but I started getting inundated with emails of both educators and parents saying, "Oh my goodness, this sounds awesome. We would love to start a school like this." And what struck me was these were folks from all over the country that appeared to be from different racial and ethnic backgrounds, different economic strata. There was something that a lot of different people sort of could come together on and find something of value. So I started thinking to myself, I was like, wow, maybe I'm onto something here. So over the course of the next several years, I started doing more research. The vast majority of my research was done during the last school year, where I had the opportunity to talk to a whole bunch of both parents who send their children to these schools, as well as the teachers and school leaders that lead these schools, and talk to them. So why did they, what draws them to these schools? What lessons have they learned, et cetera? And so, Andy, I mean, I'm glad that you brought up that kind of de Tocqueville point of there's this quintessentially American idea of banding together with your neighbors to solve problems. Because if I could describe the genesis of most of the schools that I talked about, and I should say, I think every school that I profile in the book, the earliest the oldest schools that were there were founded in the early 90s. The majority of the schools that I spoke to were probably in the last 5 to 10 years. So this is a relatively new phenomenon, though there are some sort of antecedents to this that reach further into American and world history, but we don't have to go down that path quite yet. The genesis of almost all of these schools is groups of parents who got together and had some kind of problem. In some cases, it was homeschooling parents that maybe their children were getting older and they didn't feel as comfortable teaching things like advanced math or science. It could have been families that wanted to have a little bit more structure, but not too much more structure. Some of this were traditional public school parents or public school educators that weren't happy with the offerings that were made available to them. Some were, I profile a couple schools out in California that started as dropout recovery programs. California has a long tradition of having students who drop out do kind of correspondence course type stuff that doesn't go well often. And so schools said, hey, what if we put a little bit more structure? Maybe a 5-day-a-week model doesn't work for these students, but if they could come 2 or 3 days a week, that could work. So they found these little communities of folks. They started small. Frequently, school started with 10 kids, 15 kids, 20 kids in a church basement or in a library or in an old school that had closed down. And then slowly but surely over time, they worked together, they learned together, and they grew to the point that many of these schools are thriving and have hundreds of students that are in them. So I think, that the subtitle of my book is A Guide to the Future of Education. And it was kind of a cheeky subtitle, right? Because the argument that I make in the book is not that I think every child in the future is going to attend some sort of hybrid homeschool. I should also say I submitted that before the pandemic hit and suddenly like millions of children were in hybrid homeschool. So I didn't think the future was going to show up quite so quickly. But the point that I was trying to make is that I think many of the questions that hybrid homeschools ask us about things like, how do you start a new school? How do you create a school community? How do you get teachers and parents to work together? How do schools use time? All of those questions that hybrid homeschools cause us to ask have relevance no matter what school you're talking about. So if you're talking about a traditional 5-day-a-week school, if you're talking about homeschooling, if you're talking about any of those things, those types of questions matter a great deal and are things that are worth thinking about. So I think these schools actually, for the question at hand that we have today about how do you start new institutions, how do you start new organizations, I think they have a lot to teach us. And they have a lot to teach us about how people find one another, whether it's via social media, whether it's via your local church, or whether it's through the kind of human connections of cousins and aunts and uncles and friends and the way those webs of humanity bind people together. But it also talks to us about how things learn and grow, right? That the types of people often that start these schools are different than the types of people that populate them 5 years later, right? So the first people are kind of pioneers who are open to new and different things, and they're okay if, some details need to be worked out. They can build the plane as they fly it. Whereas 5 or 10 years down the road, you have people that are much more, they want a finished product. They don't necessarily want all of the details to be worked out. So when we think about creating new institutions, I think hybrid homeschools have a lot to teach us. And so I'm super excited to continue to share these throughout the panel today.
Great. Thanks, Mike. I'm going to come back to you later on and ask these kind of tough questions about, is it an insult to the current system to start new schools? Why not just fix the schools we have? And isn't it just really too hard to start a new school? Why not just try to do reforms on what's been given to us? So we'll come back to that.
Sounds
good. Stephanie, not only have been a classroom teacher, worked with philanthropy, have thought a whole lot about Catholic schools and charter schools over time, then became an educational entrepreneur, working on actually starting a brand new, not just a set of schools, but type of schools. So what have you learned? What can you teach us?
Yeah, I'm going to be really brief and just give you an overview of the organization so you understand where I'm coming from. Seton was started at the height of the Great Recession 12 years ago in response to the dramatic decline of urban Catholic schools in this country. And my co-founder, Kit pioneer Scott Hamilton, and I wanted to figure out, are there sustainable ways to provide academically excellent, character-rich, and for those who choose it, vibrant Catholic formation? And can we think through new models? And so we pioneered a decade ago the first robust blended learning Catholic school in the country. It was in San Francisco's Mission District. And what we learned is that if you apply the use of good adaptive software to existing schools that have decent culture, you can dramatically improve academic outcomes, and you can also increase enrollment and reduce per pupil operating costs. And we replicated that model across a dozen other Catholic schools in 9 different cities. We then decided to pilot a secular charter school with a strong focus on virtue formation that offered a daily optional after-school Catholic faith formation program. And we did that in the Bronx, in New York City. And we have grown to 5 campuses, and we will grow to 8 campuses serving over 3,200 kids in the next several years. And finally, this last year, the pandemic year, we launched our own Catholic school in Cincinnati, Ohio. 98% of the parents that attend the school called Romero Academy said that they were highly satisfied or satisfied with the education that we provided. And that is the most important metric for us. How happy are parents with how we're serving their children? And so our hope is to grow both our charter model and our Romero model, our Catholic school model, in multiple geographies across the country. We are leaving the work of partnering with existing Catholic schools and transforming them in favor of launching new schools that we operate and control, because we think we have much greater impact on the outcomes and a much quicker turnaround. So I'll just give you that as a brief overview, and I look forward to the Q&A.
Great. One thing I'm going to want to press you on and learn from you about are, if people are interested in starting new types of schools, all of the lessons learned you've had about working with the government, working with parents, what are the things that they ought to be aware of? Because this social entrepreneurialism thing can look great after you've succeeded, but can be pretty, as a former school founder, can be pretty messy as you're going through the early stage. All right, Professor. Some people have a tendency to think of like the problems of higher education and the problems of K-12 separately. And part of the purpose of this event is to actually say, well, even if there are different causes of the challenges that we face or the frustrations people have, maybe there's a singular solution. Don't just keep beating your head into a wall. If you can't fix current institutions, create new ones. So I know you and some colleagues have been thinking about this question. What does social entrepreneurialism or new programs look like at the higher education level? So you want to kind of get us started on this idea of new institutions or new programs within existing institutions?
Yeah, thanks, Andy, for the invitation and the opportunity to talk about this. So I think we stand at sort of the dead end of 2 different strategies for higher education reform, extending back at least 50 years and in some ways farther than that. One aimed to establish centers or programs committed to traditional topics and methods within existing universities. And the idea is that even if the old general education requirements could no longer be sustained, it would be valuable to offer opportunities to students who did want a more traditional curriculum, a place to study it, and faculty who wanted to teach it the chance to do so. The other strategy sought to subject universities to the logic of the market. The phrase was that universities should be run like a business. And this enterprise began with policies that sought to charge students what seemed to be a fair price for higher education, replacing earlier policies that made higher education very cheap or free, and have proceeded through various strategies that have been aimed to unbundle different aspects of the college experience, so that students can choose which classes, which facilities, and more generally, which options suit their own needs, their own preferences, and their own schedules, rather than having a standardized model imposed on them. And both of these strategies, I think, have been unsuccessful. The first, because these centers, even though they were and continue to be wonderful for many students and faculty, have proved unable to influence the broader structure of the institutions that house them or the disciplines with which they are associated. So they are successful sometimes on limited terms, but haven't influenced the university as a whole. And the strategy that seeks to manage universities more like businesses has also been successful in a sense, in that its logic has been widely adopted, but I think has been destructive to the traditional liberal arts that many conservatives and right of center Americans would like to uphold. So what is the alternative? One idea that has been suggested, and I think is being discussed more widely now, is to establish a new university that would do things differently in a comprehensive way. There are different proposals for how this could be accomplished. Some relatively modest, that might involve buying and rebranding an existing college campus. Others more ambitious, that propose founding an entirely new greenfield university, including professional schools, not limited to undergraduate education. But the idea that unifies these suggestions is that the university that exists in the 21st century is no longer effective to its historical purposes or indeed to its own stated goals, and something different is necessary. Now, that sounds like a daunting task, probably even more daunting than founding a new school at the K through 12 levels. But there are historical precedents, as you mentioned, Andy, in your introduction. In the late 19th century, which was similar today in the plutocratic character of American political economy, new universities were founded by rich donors who were dissatisfied by the influence of Harvard, Yale, Princeton, and other colonial universities. And it's to this movement that we owe some of our greatest research institutions, including Johns Hopkins, the University of Chicago, and Stanford University. So it is possible, and there are a lot of rich people again. So if you are listening and you have about $1 billion burning a hole in your pocket, please do give me a call.
Well, that's well. Thank you. And
call for anyone that has
call. You can call any of us. I'm just going to go ahead and put that out there.
Yeah, so I will put in show notes all of our phone numbers so any billionaires can just get in touch if they have some money they want to be separated with. Okay, but I want us to belabor this one point a little longer, because let's imagine that we're talking to, and we probably are right now, at least 3 categories of people who could be really important for this movement. One are the social entrepreneurs themselves who may go about starting these schools. One are the philanthropists who could fund this. Another are the policymakers who could do grant programs or funding formulas to be helpful. And in the social entrepreneurs category, I'm thinking about parents, educators who just want to do something different. All of you have raised in different ways this very basic question that there is a difference between trying to reform something old, even with the best of intentions, and the hurdles you run into, and just starting fresh. A new start strategy from the beginning. So for all of the people out there who, they're only 24 hours in a day and people have other competing things on their calendars and they say, do I really want to start something new? Could each of you, if you'd like to, give us a couple sentences, maybe even a paragraph, make the case for why a new school strategy in whatever kind of domain you care about is the best path to go on, as opposed to going to the board of directors and getting a change, or talking to the principal, or talking to the university president? Why start fresh? Sam, do you want to go first this time?
Sure. The short answer is that the American university has assumed, sometimes by choice, but in many cases by accretion, far too many tasks and responsibilities, and as a result is almost entirely incoherent. Undergraduate education receives most of the attention in the media and its civic discourse, but the most important elements of many universities actually have very little to do with that. They're the hospital systems that universities run, and in some cases, their sports programs. Instructional spending and instructional programs are way down the list. So if that's what you're interested in. A university primarily as a teaching institution with a commitment to research as it informs and enriches teaching. I don't think it's going to work very well to approach institutions that are hospitals with football teams. It makes more sense to start smaller and begin again.
Great. Stephanie, thoughts?
Yeah, change is really hard. And even if you invest enormous amounts of resources, you are looking at incremental change if you're talking about an existing system that does not work well for the outcomes that you want to achieve. And so while it's expensive to start new, you are much more likely to get the end result that you want if you start new.
Great. Mike?
You know, in one way, answering your question to the social entrepreneur who says, you know, there's only so many hours in the day, or I'm not, my probably argument to that person is don't start something new. The types of people that I profile in the book that start something new, and I think, frankly, people like Stephanie, I mean, if you spend 5 minutes talking to Stephanie about schools, it's clearly something that is deep within her heart and her soul that she really feels called to do this, and that's why she does it. So on one level, it's sort of, those may not be the folks that we're reaching out to as social entrepreneurs. The types of people that start new institutions really have a certain zeal about them that they want to do that. But if you happen to be that type of person who has that zeal, but you don't know what to do, or you're scared or have those issues, the advice that I have that sort of dovetails with some of the stuff that's been said is just starting small. You know, the idea of, sure, I mean, it's incredibly daunting to start an entire university. It's incredibly daunting to start even an entire K-12 school that might have 200, 300, 400, 500 kids that are in it. But starting something like a homeschool co-op where you get 5 or 7 families together and say, hey, once or twice a week, we're going to meet and we're going to see if we can form this little community. We're going to see how we can pool resources, et cetera, and then allow that to organically grow. Now, look, there's a broader point here. And perhaps some of those other audiences that we've talked about that I think in some ways, people on the philanthropy side, people on the policy side want big now. They see the scope of the problem in the world. And I get that, that they say, oh my goodness, like, look at how huge the scale of these problems are. We need to have solutions that fit the scale of that problem. But I would say, you know, we've tried that for a while now to somewhat dubious results. What if a mindset shift is necessary to say, look, we're just going to have to start small. We're going to have to start small institutions that are allowed to grow organically, because that's the only way that real, durable quality change is going to happen over a longer period of time.
Such a great point. We are getting some excellent questions coming in from the audience. I would encourage you, please send even more of those in. I'm going to get them in a second. But I wanted to raise kind of like a dour sort of like Eeyore point here, because I think we all should address it. So I helped start a school many years ago, and then I was a charter school authorizer. And one thing that I learned is that anyone who tries to start a new program immediately catches the ire of the people who are already doing stuff. That is, a lot of people who are running a school look at the people who try to start a new school as a direct insult, that you were saying that what we're doing is bad and that you're undermining our efforts. And so how many times I ran into this brick wall of people just being furious, the existing system, the institutions that already were there, pushing back against the social entrepreneurs. It was pronounced and it was meaningful. So do any of you have like thoughts about that? Stephanie, have you run into that?
Yes, all the time. Even in the Catholic education sector, you'll have the existing Catholic schools that really do not want to see new Catholic schools start because they are worried about their own existence. And what we try to say is, look, we're offering something that's different. And it is not meant for every child, but it is meant for some children and some families who want this option. And we also believe in something that the Catholic Church teaches, is that parents should be able to decide where they send their kids to school. And that means they should have more than one option in terms of where to send their children. So yes, there's always opposition and you have to persevere through it.
Mike, are the hybrid homeschoolers?
Yeah, look, you know, they do, absolutely. But at the same time, you know, in the book, I talk about the Fleming County Public Schools, which is a rural school district about an hour outside of Lexington, Kentucky. And a few years ago, their superintendent, they have a large homeschooling contingent in their community. And I think there was some social discord around this, or at least some suspicion. Both communities kind of viewed the other with some suspicion. And what it took was a great leader of that public school district to say, hey, look, can we all get together? Let's all meet. I can't remember, they met in the cafeteria or the library. They brought the local homeschooling families into the school and said, can we work together? Like, do you have problems that maybe we can solve? Like, are there some way? And sure enough, by approaching it in that way, where it was around solving problems, where people weren't viewed as the enemy, but where people were actually finding ways to help one another, they were able to create this thing called the Fleming County Performance Academy, which is part of it's a hybrid homeschool, part of it offers some online classes for homeschooling communities. Now, look, there's a policy background to this where the state of Kentucky incentivized this behavior, so the money was there. So I get sort of exactly as Stephanie said, when it's viewed as a zero-sum game where every student that uses one option is one fewer student that uses this other option. And so there's a policy conversation about how to make everybody whole, or at least to ease that burden on folks. But honestly, what that took was just a leader who cared about his community and chose to view his neighbors not as enemies, but as friends. And they were able to work together to start something new. So I think that other superintendents could see that, other school leaders could see that, and put the overall cause before their own narrow interests.
Sam, will university presidents and boards of regents open up their arms and support social entrepreneurs who want to do something different?
I think it varies. There are some cases where they have. Maybe the most successful is the recent establishment at Arizona State of the School of Civic and Economic Leadership, which is not an entirely new institution, but it is a degree granting branch of a larger institution. And my understanding is that that was not universally popular among the faculty or the administration, but the support of the president of the university and the state legislature was sufficient to make it happen. So you're never going to make everyone happy, but it is possible, I think, to build sufficient support to accomplish some of these goals.
All right, a big question that we're getting in probably is the most important one. It's about money. How do you actually afford this kind of thing? As everyone knows, public institutions of higher education get money through the state, and then there's tuition, and K-12 schools get funding formula and often philanthropic money. So how can new schools compete? If any of you want to talk about the charter school grant program, other philanthropic dollars, startup grants, tuition, in effect, if you want to do this, where does the money come from? It doesn't come from trees. How do you afford it? Stephanie, do you want to start?
Yeah, so our money for our charter schools has come from philanthropy and from the federal government in terms of startup. And so the federal, and I know that people are worried that under the Biden administration, those federal dollars for charter school startup are going to go away. Hopefully they will not go away. Hopefully there's enough political push that those dollars stay, but they were critical. And we do what Mike advised, which is we always start small, because if you start small, you can actually build culture and nurture it over time. And so it's more expensive to start small, at least in our model, right? A hybrid homeschooling may be different, but in our models, it's more expensive to start small because you don't get the economies of scale that you need. With our Catholic model, it was pure philanthropic startup dollars. And so there wasn't, I mean, I would love to see a federal pool of money to start private schools, religious and non-religious. That support for new school startup has not developed on the private school side. So not only are the public policies and the per pupil dollars much lower on the private school side relative to the charter school side, you don't have those huge startup grants. We're starting a new school in the Rio Grande Valley, Texas, a new charter school. We're looking at getting $900,000 from the federal government for startup over a couple of years. That's huge for us. It's what is going to enable us to start the right way.
So, if you don't mind, the folks on the panel probably know this, but maybe some of our viewers don't. So, let me just give a little voiceover to these different types of programs, and certainly all of you correct me if you think I got something wrong. So, the Federal Charter School Startup Grant Program is a short-term federal program where the federal government gives money down to the state level, and states typically distribute it. In some small instances, the feds distribute themselves. But essentially, if you were approved at the state level to start a charter school through your authorizer, you can access 1 or 2 or 3 years of startup money. So this isn't long-term operational. It's money to buy books, to find a facility, to hire some staff to get up and running. And so eventually, when you have a charter school, you will get per pupil dollars through the state, but getting it up and running, this federal money can help. And philanthropic money, startup, like an entrepreneur goes to a philanthropist and says, we could really use $500,000 for 2 years so we can get this school started. And then same thing would be true with private schools, going to donors and saying, eventually we can get some tuition money to kick in, but to get this thing off the ground, we need funding. Is that about right? Is that what you would tell people watching?
Yes.
Okay, Mike, thoughts about funding when it comes to hybrid homeschooling?
Yeah, I mean, many of the schools that I profile in the book started entirely on, I mean, philanthropy is sort of a churched up word for it. I mean, it was mostly just the donated time and space of local communities. I mean, it wasn't even money. It was all in kind. So it was a church basement that allowed folks to meet there. One of the schools was started in the pole barn on someone's property. They've been started in people's living rooms. I mean, that's what we're talking about. And some of the initial teachers, because of this kind of time model, a lot of them are just parents who are not working right now. So it's moms and dads. One parent is working, and the other one is teaching classes. I mean, that's how a lot of this starts. They just don't have the startup capital for this. Now, I think there are some efforts afoot. I know there's the VELA Fund, which is a kind of a combination of the Walton Family Foundation, the Koch Foundation, and I think a couple others that banded some money together to try and create small startup grants for educational entrepreneurs. They're designed for, kind of small things that folks are doing. So I think there's some shift in the philanthropic world about some of these starting small things. But yeah, most of the schools that I looked to were outside of almost any state or federal program.
Stephanie, can I circle back to you? What we didn't talk about are vouchers, ESAs, tax credits, the private schools that you're running. Do you have any thoughts about the private school choice programs at the state level and how they can help the startup or the sustenance of new private schools?
Yeah, we need more money. Cincinnati, we get $4,650 per child, $4,650 per child.
Through like a voucher tax credit program.
And so they call it a scholarship. It's functionally a voucher, and that is not enough. And we are gonna work to do it. But these are we have some of the leanest. This is the leanest school I've ever worked with. I mean, it is incredibly lean, and we're able to pay more than the typical Catholic school, but less than the traditional public school in terms of salary. And salary is the biggest place where you're spending dollars. But we need to increase those funding amounts. And charter schools need to do the same. We need to have facilities funding. I mean, all of those policy shifts need to continue to happen.
All right, Sam, what does this look like at the higher education level? Are philanthropists interested in this? Are there any state funds that can be used to foster the development of new programs?
Well, as I mentioned in the ASU example, there are some cases of state interest, although it's not my general impression that state legislatures are feeling particularly generous right now. So I don't think that's the place that I would go. As for philanthropy, if you are a donor and perhaps $1 billion or $100 million sounds like a lot, and you wonder what to do, I beg you, do not give money to Harvard or Yale or Princeton or any of the other handful of universities that have very high prestige, but also more money than they know what to do with. There are many existing institutions and programs that would benefit far more from your support. So I do think that there is a tension sometimes between the express preferences of donors for innovation and new institution and their revealed preferences for giving to the same handful of places that enjoy the greatest prestige. There are many other options that could make better use of the money.
Got it. So let's try to put a fine point on this segment of our conversation. Let's pretend right now we're talking to policymakers and philanthropists, and they love this idea of new schools, and now they're thinking to themselves, they're going to go talk to their staffs. How do we make sure that we incubate, foster the development of a new school strategy? What would each of you say to the policymakers and the philanthropists? Like, is it a venture fund? Is it a startup grant program? Is it operational dollars in perpetuity facilities? What would you ask them for?
I mean, to sort of echo what Stephanie had said earlier on the K-12 side, money following kids, right? So any of those infusions of philanthropic dollars or startup dollars would be by definition short term, right? Because that's a different question. Asking a philanthropist or even asking the state to provide a amount of money for a defined period of time to accomplish a direct goal versus saying to a philanthropist, well, if you fund this school, you're going to need to continue funding it in perpetuity for it to exist. So I think that on that side has to happen for these schools to be able to grow, to be able to attract the philanthropic dollars that you need. And then obviously, if I'm talking to state legislators, I'm also talking a lot on the regulatory side, which is to say that many of these schools that start on the private side start in states like Texas for a reason. There are varying levels of homeschooling regulations across the country that vary from everything from you can just homeschool your kid to providing detailed records, having a certified teacher go over everything that your child does. I mean, so it just from Texas to Massachusetts, there's a whole gamut of options that are there. So really thinking about the regulatory burdens that exist, whether it's around teacher certification, whether it's around class sizes, whether it's around all sorts of things that people don't often think of how regulated even private or homeschools are. I think there's a big belief that private schools and homeschools are like completely unregulated and everybody can do whatever they want. It's definitely not true on the private school side. In many, many places, it's not true on the homeschooling side. So creating that space as well for these places to even get off the ground, because if you have a small school of like 10 or 12 kids trying to comply with all of the state requirements on any number of different things, like that's just not, you're not going to have the capacity to do that. So I think that's important as well.
Stephanie, what would be on your top 3 or top 5
I think
list?
Mike nailed it. The only thing I would add, it means it's money following children, some money for startup, dedicated money for startup, and then I'd add equal footing for facilities. It's a huge expense. It's upwards of 30%. 20% typically, 15 to 20% typically for your facilities. That's a big chunk of your operating budget. And so getting that on an equal playing field with district schools would be huge. Great.
Sam?
Well, so I've made my pitch to would-be donors, to policymakers, and especially members of Congress. I would say that they should revisit the accreditation process, which is well-intentioned and is designed to ensure that federal funds are not directed to institutions that aren't doing their job, but in practice imposes extremely expensive and often politically charged requirements on institutions of higher education that make it difficult to try new arrangements and establish new colleges.
I mean, if I could add, I love all these ideas. If I could add one, it would be along the lines of, I would love to see a philanthropic or even state level program, incentive grant program, sort of like a startup. I don't know, $1 million, 10 grants of $100,000 each to entrepreneurs so they can think up an idea and develop the plans for a new institution of higher education, kind of like they've done with the charter school grant program at the K-12 level. There just needs to be something to get these people off the ground, I'd say. All right, so let me transition to this other set of questions, which is, we've talked about the how, but now let's talk about the why. Why is it that, like, what are families looking for? What are students looking for? What are educators looking for? If we're going to create new schools, how should they be different? Stephanie, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I think the big question is not what educators are looking for, but what are parents looking for? So I think They are the clients. They are the one we should be serving. And what's interesting is the families that we serve, which are predominantly living in under-resourced communities, they want safety, number one. They want respect. So they want to be able to go into a school and feel respected and welcomed. And then they do want academic excellence, and our parents want character and civic education. Something they don't want, I mean, with the tragic murder of George Floyd, there's been a huge push for anti-racist cultures at schools. This is not coming from parents. We have not had a single one of the parents of our 5,000 students that we're serving say, we want you to do more of this anti-racist work. This is really coming from elite teachers, mainly women, and many of whom are white women, who are pushing an ideology that is not coming from parents. And so it's been a very tricky environment to navigate in that context. And we've always come back to, what is it that our parents want? They want safety, they want respect, they want academic excellence, and they want character formation.
It's a profound point that sometimes what parents want doesn't align with what the elites or the funders want. And I think we need to do a whole lot better job listening to the families who care about their kids more than anyone. Mike, as you've talked to so many of these families, are they worried about curriculum in traditional public schools? Do they just want more online learning? Do they just want to spend more time with their kids? Why this hybrid homeschooling model?
Yeah, the thing that came up over and over again, I kept hearing this phrase, the gift of time. Perhaps an illustrative example. I was speaking to a school leader who I think was in Columbia, Missouri, in my backyard here. And he told me, I was telling him, what types of families choose this school? Why do they choose? And he said, do you ever watch back at, at back to school time, you'll see a meme go around Facebook or Instagram where you have the children with their backpacks on in the foreground and they're like sad faces or they're crying and the parents are in the background high-fiving or popping champagne bottles or something because, summer's over and that's great for the parents and it's bad for the kids. He said, our parents don't really share that one. That's not really their vibe. That's not really their scene. Many of these families think that they want to spend more time with their kids. And they think even more broadly than that the typical school day and the school week and the school year is out of sync with the rhythms of their family life. That not only is it just the school day, but then what happens afterwards. If students are involved in extracurricular activities and then they have homework after that, parents will go days without having the ability to really spend quality time with their kids. And so, frankly, a lot of stuff around academics or others was below that. They're like, look, I'm missing my kids growing up. They're maybe doing great in school, but this is something that's way more important to us than that. So that type of stuff, thinking about the rhythms of family life and how school intersects with that was something that came up over and over again. And a second phrase that I heard a ton, actually amongst parents, was related to community. What they talked about was trying to find other families that they could kind of, quote unquote, do life together with. So again, those types of folks who look at that meme of the kids crying and think, I don't identify with that. That's not right. They may be kind of in the minority, right? And at least in the community that they're living in, they're like, wow, like everyone I know seems to feel that way, but I don't. But sure enough, through church or through friends or through whatever, they find these other people that are kind of weird like they are, right? It's like, oh no, wait, we actually want to spend more time with our kids, not less time with our kids. And they're able to create these little communities. They can do life together. I'll tell you just one more story that blew me away. I was talking to about this time last year because it was all of my field work had to become virtual. And so I was on a Zoom kind of focus group with a bunch of parents from one of these schools in the Midwest. And a guy got on there and he was talking about, how'd you find out about the school? What were you drawn to? And he said, look, we went to an open house that was hosted in the backyard of one of the school's families. It was a big barbecue. And he said the kids were playing and it was this kind of bucolic upper Midwestern scene taking place. But he said, when I was driving home, I looked over at my wife after meeting all the other families that are involved. And he said, those guys are better dads than I am. And I need to spend more time with them. And I was like, again, as someone who studies education, mostly focuses on the kids and the outcomes of the kids and that, that just hit me. And maybe I'd become a father not like a few months before that. And it just like hit me like a freight train. And I was like, wow, when we think about how schools are communities and that they're places where families come together and teachers come together and children come together, a person that was drawn to that, that thought about his own development as a father and how school intersects with that, I thought was really wild. So that whole community piece, I think people are really looking for in our increasingly kind of alienated, polarized, atomized world. People are trying to find communities and getting together. It's a classic like Yuval Levin point, right? Like people come together to do things together, not just to be together. So people coming together to create the school, create these wonderful tight-knit communities that were very supportive of one another.
What an important point. Let me just underline this, that institutions like schools are formative in so many different ways, and not just on students, although that may be primary. They form adults too, not only the educators inside, but the parents, the community members outside of them. And the idea that helping start a new school can be the kind of thing that helps shapes adults in better ways is something that I think we've talked too little about. All right, Sam, so at the higher education level, are new schools something that students are demanding? Would professors like them? Would administrators like them?
I think that there is certainly demand among students, and more demand than you might expect among professors for a return to a style of higher education that is neither politicized in some of the same ways that Stephanie describes, nor overwhelmingly professionalized. And more devoted to internships and the acquisition of what are imagined to be marketable skills than the study of some of the great works of Western and indeed world civilization. I don't think that everybody feels that way, but that's okay. It doesn't need to be for everyone. And I read just on Twitter this morning that the acceptance rate at Hillsdale College has dropped to about 20%, which makes it more selective today than Harvard was until about 1970. And that's great news for Hillsdale, which is one of the existing institutions that exemplifies this idea. But it also suggests that there is yet more demand that could be met by new institutions.
Okay, we don't have too much time left, maybe 8 or 9 minutes. Please, if anyone else has some questions, send them in. But I want to get to this point, which is I think, especially some of our progressive friends, their response to some of this conversation would probably be something along the lines of, we have public institutions and longstanding institutions for a reason. They have been they've been the equality part of our social fabric. Every time folks talk about new schools, it has a tinge of segregation in different ways, smaller communities excluding themselves from the greater we, people with particular interests, and it leads to the shattering of us rather than bringing us all together. So how do you all respond to this idea that instead we ought to be giving our energy to these longstanding public institutions that are part of the unum, as opposed to these new school efforts that can be small in particular, that are more about pluribus, given that we have so many problems with the splintering of America? How do you respond to this issue of new schools, small, splinters us as opposed to bringing us all together?
I mean, we're already pretty splintered. So, and a lot of that stuff happened under this sort of existing regime of organization. So it's not clear to me that those institutions, at least on the K-12 side, I think people are kind of nostalgic for a time that never existed, that the K-12 schools haven't been this great place where people come together. And part of it, I would argue, is that it's tough to bring people together. I think so many traditional schools, and frankly, like some private schools fall into this as well. It's not just in the public school realm, but they kind of become like the Faber College from Animal House, whose motto was "knowledge is good," right? Where it's like, well, like, what do you all really believe in? Like, do you actually have some vision of like the good life? Do you actually have some, where I went to high school, there was the idea of the graduate at graduation. There was this idea that like when someone leaves this institution, that they will be different or they will know things. And because I think we've tried to push for these bigger schools that are, in K-12, they're just like all the people that live in this geographic area are all going to go here. It's like, well, I mean, it's tough to unite all of those people around a vision of what you're trying to do. And so then there's none of that kind of great space that the civil society creates for us. So I think that actually drives people to become more atomized, because it's either get with the program of our public school district, or you're sort of excluded from it. Whatever, if you're outside of the narrow majority that happens here, and even most of the time, school boards are elected by some tiny fraction of the people that are actually there. I would argue that creating these new types of institutions will actually do more to weave the fabric together, because it will engage people in shared projects, right? Where people will say, look, we want to start this new school that's going to, in my case, it's going to have this kind of hybrid model. Well, turns out you need some other families to do that. And it doesn't matter what their race is. It kind of doesn't matter what their politics are. It doesn't matter. We're all working together to try and do this thing. And then after you've done this shared thing, then maybe you're chatting with one another. Oh, I didn't realize that you were a Democrat. Or I didn't realize you were a Republican. Well, that's like a second or third order concern, because we're trying to do this thing for our kids. So I actually think this generative, creative, positive thing will do more to weave that fabric back together than to rend it apart.
Stephanie, have you found that?
The one thing I will say is that our schools are segregated. So at least where we're operating, New York City and the Bronx, the schools are segregated. And so our goal is to give parents the kind of education they want for their children. We're less concerned about the unity that we think. I just think it's a super complicated problem that has multiple layers, and I don't think we're positioned to solve it. We're a neighborhood school. So we are serving families who walk their kids to school. And we have no busing, and so parents walk their kids to school. We see them in the morning, and we see them in the afternoon, which is one of the strengths of our schools. But no, we're not trying to solve that problem. We're just trying to give people a decent shot at making it in this country.
Thanks. Sam, one question came in here toward the end, and I think it's might be directed for you, more along the lines of, in some higher education institutions, there are programs inside of institutions, mini programs, mini institutions that might already be doing what you have in mind. Maybe a philanthropist sets something up. It has enough protection from the institution as a whole that it can operate like an oasis in a desert. Do you think that there are enough examples of that could be a model, or do you think ultimately that's not the way to invest because they end up becoming part of the system that we're trying to separate from?
Yeah, I don't want to be too sweeping in my description here, but I'm skeptical of that model when it's just about offering a particular set of courses to a certain number of students who want them, which can be very good for them, but doesn't tend to influence the direction of the institution as a whole, or the discipline with which these programs are associated. And in the worst case, can become a sort of excuse that provides the appearance of intellectual and political diversity without really threatening the existing balance of interests and opinions. The exception to that, I would say, are programs that operate more like academic departments, which means that they can do their own tenure track or long-term hiring and can offer degrees. In that case, as with ASU, they really are operating more like independent institutions and less like oases, which are very pleasant and important to those who find them, but offer less to the majority wandering in the desert.
Got it. All right, we're almost at time, so let me give each of you 1 minute to close up, and let's try to make this as tactical or direct as possible for the people who, because I know there's an audience out there that is they're very interested in the subject, and they might want to know, what do I do now? So, Mike, let's start with you. What would you advise in your 1 minute? How do we advance this cause, whether through policy, philanthropy, or something else?
Well, look, I think that the best thing that we can do is to change our mindset around scale. K-12 education is obsessed with scale. For years, it's always been, oh, your school's great, but can you scale it up? Can you run 20 of them, or can you run 50 of them? And if you couldn't do that, philanthropists, policymakers are said, you're fine, but you kind of need to go over there. I think we need a mindset shift that says small is good. Actually, it turns out starting a small school and running it well is super hard to do, and we should celebrate people that do it. And we should look to saying, rather than trying to find one massive solution, try and find a lot of little solutions.
That's awesome. Stephanie, final thoughts.
Yeah, that's great advice. I would encourage parents to continue to demand choices and the ability to choose. And every and all parents demand that you have a choice of where you send your child to school. It's just way too many hours in that child's lifetime. It's so formative. It's so important. Parents should be able to choose.
That's great. All right, bring us home, Sam.
Yeah, well, I think I'll echo Stephanie to a slightly different purpose. If you have children who are trying to decide where or whether to attend college, don't be distracted by prestige or spurious rankings. Many of the most successful colleges and universities are those that have a distinct sense of what they are and what they're doing, which is based on often a religious commitment or another specific mission. And I encounter too many parents and students who I think worry that their lives will be damaged if they don't go to the most expensive and famous university they possibly can. It's not true. And there are better opportunities elsewhere for many students, and I hope that the range of those opportunities can be increased.
Well, we're at 3 o'clock sharp, and not only is the timing perfect, but I could not have asked for more out of our 3 outstanding panelists. So thank you so much. I've learned a lot from all of you in the years past, but this last hour has been very edifying for me. I feel like I'm much better able to tackle this topic, and I hope the viewers feel the exact same way. So thank you so much for your participation, and the people watching at home or in their offices. Please continue to watch and keep track of Manhattan Institute events, and we hope to see you soon. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Andy.
Thank you.